Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Monday, the 20th of May here in London. I'm Caroline Hepke.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Iran's president and foreign minister are killed in a helicopter crash. We look at who may take over and what it could mean for the broader Middle East.
In other news, London still leads Europe in attracting foreign direct investment into financial services.
Plus, private equity's massive UK debt binge sparks warnings of danger. We have a special report.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi has been killed in a helicopter crash, according to a number of Iranian news sources. The semi-official Mehr news agency reports that Foreign Minister Hossein Amirabdollahian has also died in the crash. The convoy consisted of 3 helicopters. The wreckage was found on Sunday in a mountainous area of the country, but dense fog hampered rescue efforts. Bloomberg's Middle East editor Paul Wallace says questions remain over what happens next.
The government itself has not put out an official statement yet saying, for example, who now takes over. It's likely to be the vice president, someone who's called Mohammed Mehr. In some ways, a lot of what's gone on in Iran in the last couple of years in terms of its foreign policy, we're not down to Raisi so much as the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. He obviously remains in position.
Bloomberg's Paul Wallace speaking there. The news comes in the middle of the Israel-Hamas conflict in Gaza, with Hamas supported by Iran and tensions with the US over Iran-backed Houthis attacking ships in the Red Sea.
Well, Ebrahim Raisi, aged 63, was an ultra-conservative cleric who was elected in 2021 following 8 years under the relative moderate Hassan Rouhani. Raisi was seen as a favourite to eventually succeed the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who's in his 80s. Richard Dalton is a former British ambassador to Iran. He says that Raisi was important but not irreplaceable.
But a figure that was trusted by the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and by the other organs of power, like the judiciary and the parliament, could be appointed quite quickly to take his place.
Richard Dalton speaking there. Raisi entered office pledging to end efforts to build trade ties with the West and instead focused on developing links with China and Russia. But Raisi's time as president has been marked by economic problems at home, including successive lows for the Iranian currency against the US dollar, also the most widespread and violent protests in the country's recent history, triggered by the death of a young woman held in police custody.
To other news now, 2 of the 3 members of Israel's war cabinet are continuing to put pressure on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to change course on the war in Gaza. On Saturday, opposition leader Benny Gantz said he'd quit the cabinet by the 8th of June if the Israeli leader didn't make changes. He wants Netanyahu to agree to a 6-point plan with the return of hostages a top priority.
I just understand that we are facing a very long campaign, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in other places, but the hostages, they don't have that much time.
Israeli War Cabinet member Benny Gantz speaking there. His proposals also include demilitarising Gaza and supporting efforts to normalise relations with Saudi Arabia. Analysts say Netanyahu's governing coalition is likely to remain secure even if Gantz carries out his threat to resign.
Now, London still leads European cities when it comes to securing foreign direct investment for new financial services projects. But a new survey warns that Paris is likely to challenge London's dominance in the years ahead. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has more.
London secured 81 foreign financial projects last year. A survey by Ernst & Young shows a 76% increase in investments compared to the previous year, with the city accounting for a third of all financial FDI in Europe. Although Brexit and poor equity market performance has raised concerns about the UK's competitiveness, London secured more than double the investment of second-place Paris. But data shows that investors still rank Paris ahead of London over a 3-year horizon, with many on Wall Street touting the French capital as Europe's next financial hub. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
The cost of buying a typical home in the UK has reached a record high. The property website Rightmove says demand has pushed up the average house price to just over £375,000. That's an increase of 0.8% from last month. Property sales also jumped by 17% in the first 4 months of the year when compared with the same period in 2023.
Staying here in the UK, the government is expected to unveil a compensation package worth more than £10 billion over the decades-long contaminated blood scandal. Thousands of people died after contracting illnesses from contaminated, unscreened blood. Bloomberg's James Wilcock has more.
Between the 1970s and 1990s, some 30,000 people who were given blood transfusions in the UK contracted HIV or hepatitis C. More than 40 years on, an inquiry reports today on what has been described as the biggest treatment disaster in NHS history. Bloomberg has told the government intends to spend billions on compensation, reflecting what Defence Secretary Grant Shapps called a shameful failure.
It just makes you angry inside to hear about all the different essentially lack of anybody taking responsibility, mismanagement.
But the announcement comes at a fiscally difficult moment for the government, who have barely any headroom, yet want to cut taxes in the autumn. In London, James Wilcock, Bloomberg Radio.
Now to our top story this morning. Various Iranian news sources say that Iran's president and foreign minister have both been killed in a helicopter crash in the northwest of the country. It comes at a time of turmoil in the Middle East over the war in Gaza, which has threatened to edge Iran and Israel into all-out conflict. Joining us now is our head of Middle East and North Africa coverage, Stuart Livingston-Wallace. Good morning, Stuart. Thank you for being with us. What is the latest then that we are hearing about this crash?
So it started sort of yesterday evening, and it's been a long night. So we know the helicopter, I think it was one of three travelling together, but we'd heard that it had, I think, what was initially reported as a hard landing, and that was sort of yesterday evening. And then I think it's just taken a great deal of time to actually get to this site. It's in a mountainous area. We've seen some of the social media videos being sent out from the site, and things are very foggy. There was heavy rain and so on. So they did send some helicopters in to try and find the site, but I just say they couldn't see anything through the fog. So they had to go basically in cars or 4x4s and go and find the site. And really that only happened in the last couple of hours. And then the death has been confirmed by state media, I suppose, in the last hour or so. So it's been a long, long time since the initial reports and then the confirmation that he is indeed dead.
Now, Raisi was an ultra-conservative cleric, a former Chief Justice, and had been the favourite to eventually succeed the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. How does this affect the hardline leadership of Iran, which has faced protests over issues like the economy and human rights?
It has. I mean, I think in terms of the long-term implication for Iran, it doesn't really change the equation. So there were really two favourites to take over from Khamenei, the supreme leader. One was obviously Raisi, and the second one was Khamenei's son, who is, as you can guess, also something of an ultra-conservative. So it was a choice between two very hard-line figures. So in terms of that future, if things transpire the way we anticipate them, then you still end up with a hardline leadership one way or another. Now, what potentially changes here is in terms of just the balance of power within the internal hardline camps, because you have the military in the form, you have the army, but you also have the IRGC, and then there are potentially some changes there. But if fundamentally anyone's anticipating a major change of policy direction as a result of Raisi's death, I don't think that's going to be the case in the slightest.
What then does it mean for the conflict in the Middle East? I mean, Iran does have a very, opaque political system, as you say, restricted political structure. But in terms of the external facing conflict within the Middle East, Iran did launch a drone and missile attack against Israel last month. That was seen also as a counterattack. Iran and Israel and open conflict, that has been a significant worry.
Yeah. I mean, again, I don't think it changes a great deal, because ultimately the final decision on what was launched and where to was taken by Khamenei. And obviously he remains in office. When he's eventually replaced potentially by a son, again, you should anticipate quite a similar sort of set of circumstances in terms of that decision making. So going forward, yes, Iran will continue to support its proxies across the region, but at the same time, it really depends what happens on the ground in Gaza.
What practically does this mean for Iran at the moment? What is the succession plan for the president, and does it mean that there will be further elections?
It does. So we don't know exactly when they take place. For now, the vice president takes over, and then new elections take place, we presume, in the next several months. But of course, those election process is absolutely different to what you would anticipate in a Western democracy. So there is an assembly of experts who basically decides who can run and who can't. And as we saw in the last election in 2021, fundamentally they will only allow ultra-conservative candidates to stand. So I think in the 2021 election, which is the one Raisi won, it was something like 600 candidates came forward, and I think only basically a dozen got through that final vetting process. And there were no, veteran politicians. There were no moderates. There was nothing even resembling a moderate in the final camp. As a consequence of which, you saw this record low turnout for the election. Basically, there is a very large proportion of the electorate in Iran that has effectively given up on those elections, ever really offering them any sort of choice beyond one ultra-conservative over another.
Okay, in terms of political reaction and response, even over the weekend, Chuck Schumer in the US was saying that there was no evidence of foul play. Clearly, with the kind of deep tensions within the Middle East, Tehran, backs Hamas, the Houthis and Hezbollah, this would be a question that you would anticipate coming, right?
Yeah, and I'm sure within Iran itself there will be, furious conspiracy theories being spun. I think the reality is that the most likely explanation is that they were travelling on reasonably old equipment, because it is absolutely true that Iran's been under sanctions for a very long time and has really struggled to get the equipment needed to maintain its helicopters. Now, we don't know exactly what he was travelling on, but the chances are it was a pretty old piece of equipment. And then you layer in on top of that they were in a mountainous area, that it was incredibly foggy, that there was heavy rain, and on and on and on. And that does appear to be the most likely explanation. Now, again, this is not my area of expertise, but I can tell you that, particularly in this part of the world, helicopters crash quite a bit. However, that will not necessarily stop those conspiracy theories building up within Iran, particularly because he was one of the favourites to take over from the Supreme Leader. Supreme Leader's in something like his mid-80s. So obviously we don't know exactly how long it'll be before he passes away, but when you're in your mid-80s, chances are it's going to happen in the next few years.
Okay, Stuart, thank you very much for now. That's Stuart Livingston-Wallace there, our head of Middle East and North Africa coverage. Okay, we're going to turn to a different story now here in the UK, where private equity firms took over British businesses in droves after the Brexit vote. It suppressed valuations, and the new buyers piled large amounts of debt on those companies in the process. But in a higher rate environment, this is now starting to bite. The Bank of England and politicians are worried that this increased dependency on debt over recent years creates risks for systemically important employers in Britain. Joining us now to discuss is our corporate finance reporter, Abhinav Ramnarayan. Abhinav, good morning to you. Great to have you with us on the programme. Why did private equity companies target the UK in particular in recent years?
Many private equity firms are based in the US, and of course, there's a cultural familiarity with the UK, and the UK has an investor-friendly setup, so it was always attractive for US private equity firms in particular. But this was supercharged after the Brexit vote because valuations fell in the UK on the London Stock Exchange, as did the sterling currency. So this created what people started calling the Brexit discount and made the UK a very attractive place for private equity companies.
And so there's been a lot of debt piled on some well-known names here in the UK like Morrison's and Asda, Pizza Express, Madame Tussauds. But policymakers are really quite worried about this now. What do you think might happen?
That's a really good question. At the moment, the Bank of England is looking very closely at this issue. They're looking at whether or not there's any systemic risk attached to all the debt that's been added to UK PLC, as it were. And I think the Labour government has been making some noises about increasing tax on certain types of private equity gains. But I do think it's a tricky one, both for policymakers and for politicians, because especially after Brexit, attracting investment in the UK has proven a challenge. I mean, just look at the lack of IPOs on the London Stock Exchange, while Amsterdam is able to attract IPOs. So I think they're going to have to thread that needle of making sure there isn't too much debt in the system, while also not scaring away private equity investors. They need them.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.